When the Cuban Revolution succeeded in 1959, Ernesto Guevara stood on the side of history that had won. The old regime was gone. The revolutionaries were no longer fugitives moving through jungles and safe houses. They were now the government. For many, this was the moment the struggle ended. For Che Guevara, it was the moment something new and far more complicated began. Power arrived quickly and without ceremony. Ministries were formed. Institutions were seized. Laws were rewritten. Che was given responsibility almost immediately, not because he sought authority, but because he was trusted to enforce discipline. His reputation had been built during the war. He was organized, uncompromising, and believed hesitation could undo everything they had fought for. At first, power felt like confirmation. The revolution had proven that force could dismantle a system that refused reform. Che believed this validated the conclusions he had reached years earlier while traveling across Latin America. Systems protected themselves with violence. Only organized confrontation could remove them. Cuba appeared to be the evidence. But victory changed the environment. The chaos of revolution was replaced by administration. Decisions were no longer theoretical. They affected real lives immediately. Che now sat on the other side of authority, responsible not for opposing power, but for exercising it. This transition exposed realities that had been invisible during the struggle. Maintaining order required measures that went beyond idealism. Opposition had to be controlled. Loyalty had to be enforced. Mistakes carried consequences not for individuals, but for the stability of the entire project. Che approached these responsibilities with severity. He believed the revolution could not survive weakness. To him, discipline was not cruelty. It was preservation. Yet the deeper he moved into governance, the more contradictions emerged. The structures they had overthrown were gone, but new structures quickly took their place. Bureaucracy formed. Hierarchies solidified. Compromise became unavoidable. Che began to notice that power did not disappear when seized. It changed hands, but it retained its demands. Control required administration. Administration required restraint. And restraint slowed transformation. This reality unsettled him. Che had joined the revolution to destroy systems that produced suffering. Now he was helping manage one. Even with good intentions, authority demanded stability. And stability felt dangerously close to stagnation. The urgency that had defined the struggle was fading, replaced by procedures, meetings, and incremental change. Outside Cuba, Che's image began spreading rapidly. Photographs circulated. Headlines followed. He was no longer simply a revolutionary. He was becoming a symbol. While others embraced this recognition, Che found it deeply uncomfortable. The image did not reflect the doubts forming beneath the surface. Power had delivered victory, but it had also introduced limits. And for the first time, Che Guevara began to question whether winning a revolution was the same as changing the world. As Che Guevara settled into his role within the new Cuban government, the distance between revolutionary ideals and governing reality grew increasingly difficult to ignore. Decisions that once belonged to abstract theory now carried immediate consequences. Policies affected livelihoods. Orders determined freedom or confinement. The revolution was no longer an idea moving forward, it was a system that had to function. Che was placed in positions that demanded authority rather than inspiration. He oversaw institutions, participated in the reorganization of the state, and enforced revolutionary discipline. To many around him, he represented firmness and resolve. To Che himself, these responsibilities felt necessary but uncomfortable. Power required certainty, and certainty left little room for doubt. He approached governance with the same intensity that had defined his role in the armed struggle. Efficiency mattered. Delay felt dangerous. Opposition, whether ideological or practical, was seen as a threat to the survival of the revolution. Che believed that failure to act decisively would invite counter-revolution and foreign interference. History, as he understood it, punished hesitation. Yet with time, the costs of this rigidity became harder to dismiss. Che began to observe how authority reshaped behavior, even among those who had fought for the same cause. Positions created distance. Titles created hierarchy. Loyalty increasingly flowed toward power rather than principles. The revolution had promised equality, but governance required structure, and structure inevitably produced imbalance. Economic realities added another layer of frustration. Che was tasked with responsibilities that extended far beyond warfare, industrial planning, economic reform, and state management. These roles demanded compromise with global systems he had spent years criticizing. International trade, production quotas, and negotiations forced the revolution into contact with the very mechanisms it had opposed. Che found this deeply unsettling. He believed that revolution was meant to dismantle exploitation, not adapt to it. Yet sustaining the new state required engagement with existing economic structures. Progress came slowly. Resistance came quickly. Idealism collided with practicality at every turn. The urgency that once defined revolutionary action was diluted by the need for stability. As these pressures mounted, Che's dissatisfaction became more pronounced. He questioned whether holding power inevitably transformed revolutionaries into administrators, whether the act of governing slowly reshaped priorities, replacing transformation with preservation. The more he examined his role, the more he sensed a widening gap between what he had fought for and what power demanded. Publicly, Che remained committed. Privately, doubts accumulated. He began to feel confined by the very authority he had helped create. Power, once seized, demanded constant maintenance. It pulled attention inward, toward control and survival, rather than outward toward change. Che feared that revolution, if allowed to settle, would lose its momentum and its purpose. These realizations did not lead him to abandon his beliefs. They sharpened them. Che began to view his position in Cuba not as an endpoint, but as evidence of a larger problem. Revolution, he concluded, could not remain local. If it paused, it decayed. And if power inevitably softened resolve, then perhaps true revolution required movement rather than control. This belief would soon push him away from the center of authority, and back toward the uncertainty he understood far better than governance. As Che Guevara's unease with governing deepened, his behavior began to change in subtle but telling ways. He withdrew from public appearances when possible. He spent less time in ceremonial roles and more time studying conflicts beyond Cuba's borders. His attention shifted outward, toward places where inequality still operated without interruption. Che no longer believed that holding power was enough. In fact, he began to suspect that power itself imposed limits on revolutionary intent. The longer a revolution governed, the more it was forced to negotiate with the structures it had once opposed. Stability required compromise. Compromise diluted urgency. And urgency, Che believed, was the engine of real change. This belief placed him at odds with others in the leadership. While many focused on consolidating gains within Cuba, Che viewed containment as failure. To him, revolution that did not expand was revolution that stagnated. He feared that isolation would turn Cuba into an exception rather than a catalyst. Che's solution was consistent with his logic. If power constrained transformation, then he would step away from it. He resigned from his official posts without hesitation. Titles, influence, and security held little value for him compared to momentum. His departure surprised many, but to Che it was inevitable. He turned his focus to international struggle. Africa became his first destination. There, Che hoped to ignite revolutionary movements similar to those he had helped lead in Cuba. The reality was harsher than he anticipated. Local conditions differed. Internal divisions weakened cohesion. External interference was constant. The clarity that had guided him in Cuba was absent. Despite these obstacles, Che pressed forward. Failure did not dissuade him. Instead, it reinforced his belief that revolution required absolute commitment, regardless of outcome. He interpreted resistance not as a signal to retreat, but as confirmation that entrenched systems would always defend themselves. From Africa, Che's attention returned to South America. Bolivia became the next focus. Strategically, it appeared central. Symbolically, it represented the heart of the continent he believed could be unified through shared struggle. But Bolivia presented challenges he could not fully control. Support was fragmented. Communication unreliable. Local populations were cautious. International surveillance was constant. Che operated under increasing isolation, cut off from the networks that had once sustained him. Yet he remained. This persistence was not driven by optimism. It was driven by consistency. Che had built a worldview that left little room for retreat. To abandon the effort now would have required questioning the logic that had guided him from medicine to revolution. As conditions worsened, Che became increasingly aware of the narrowing options. Survival demanded withdrawal. Withdrawal demanded compromise. And compromise, to him, felt indistinguishable from defeat. By the time the situation in Bolivia reached its breaking point, Che Guevara understood exactly where his path had led. And he chose not to turn back. On October 9, 1967, Che Guevara was executed in a small schoolhouse in La Higuera, Bolivia. There was no trial, no public explanation, no effort to frame the moment as anything other than what it was. The decision had been made quietly, efficiently, and without delay. The revolution he believed in would not be defeated in the field, it would be ended in silence. Che was 39 years old. Those who witnessed his final hours described him as calm. There is no reliable evidence that he attempted to negotiate his survival or reshape his legacy. By this point, the outcome no longer shocked him. The path he had chosen had narrowed for years, and Bolivia was not an accident. It was the logical end of a worldview that allowed no room for retreat. His death immediately transformed him. Che Guevara ceased to exist as a complex historical figure and became an image. His face was separated from his choices. His ideals were celebrated, while the consequences of his actions were simplified or ignored. To supporters, he became a symbol of resistance. To critics, a symbol of violence. Both interpretations reduced a complicated life into something easier to consume. What is often overlooked is how consistent Che was with himself. He did not abandon power because he failed at it. He left because power demanded compromise, and compromise violated the logic that had guided him from the beginning. He believed that systems of domination could not be reformed from within. When revolution turned into governance, he saw it as the beginning of decay. Che did not seek martyrdom, but he accepted its possibility without hesitation. To him, survival mattered less than coherence. To live while retreating from his conclusions would have meant betraying everything that had come before. In that sense, his death was not an end he resisted, it was one he recognized. History continues to argue over whether Che Guevara should be remembered as a hero or a villain. That debate often misses the deeper lesson. The danger in Che's story is not rebellion itself, but certainty. The belief that conviction, once reached, must never be questioned. That doubt is weakness. That compromise is failure. Che Guevara believed power corrupted revolutions. And yet, he could not escape the power of his own certainty. He took power after the revolution, and he did not like what he saw. That discomfort pushed him away from authority, away from safety, and toward a path that offered no return. This is not a story about winning or losing. It is a story about what happens when belief becomes absolute. and why Che Guevara chose consistency over survival.